Now, before we go on, now we need to go back to our backend, right, inside the favorite controller. So as you can see, we have this method that is going to populate our vacancy, right? That is going to populate our vacancy. So if we go to if I go to Postman, you can see this is our vacancy, which is vacancy ID with the title, description, requirements, salary, skill checks, and so on, right? So as you can see, if we go on to our vacancy, we have the company right here, right? We have a company, which is a nested JS, but in this case, in our favorites, we don't have the company JSON, right? So basically what we need to do is we just need to modify our backend, right? So inside our populate, what we can simply do is we'll simply populate again inside our populate. We'll simply populate with the company, right? So the path that we want is the company schema, right? We want the company schema, and then the model is going to be the company, right? And then the model is going to be the company, right? So if we can save our database so that if we can save our code so that it can restart, right? So now what we simply have to do is let's go back to our Postman, right? And let's try to get favorite items, right? As you can see, now we have the company, right? The company details. So basically, if you don't have the company details, what will happen is we'll get an error when we try to get vacancies. As you can see, if we go to our application that we are building, right? If we go to application that we are building, if you go to the vacancy model, right, inside the vacancy model, you can see that we have the company here. So inside the favorites, if we don't have this company, model right here, we'll end up getting an error, right? So after that, now we can begin continuing with our application, right? Okay guys, now that we have fixed our backend favorites, right? So now what we can do is go inside our features folder, inside our favorites. Let's create the models folder, right? And then let's create also the repository. And let's create the last one, which is going to be our controller. Okay, so now if I pull out Postman, right, as you can see from our Postman here, we have the vacancy JSON model, right? We have the vacancy JSON object right here. Yeah, so if I just expand it, you can see that it contains the vacancy details, the title, description, requirements, skill text, salary, and also we have inside this, we have another nested JSON object, which is going to be the company that contains the company information, right? So basically what we are simply going to do is let's go here and let's create our favorite model, right? So let's create a favorite model.dat, right? And then inside the company model, let's simply go and copy let's copy this company model, right? And then let's go inside our favorite model, and then let's simply paste it here, and then let's change this to favorite, right? So let's also refactor this company here, and let's also refactor this company right here, and then let's also refactor this one, right? Then let's change this from company to favorite. Right, and also let's refactor this company to also favorite. model, right? So now basically what we need here is we need a vacancy model, right, to represent the JSON vacancy model, right? And the next thing is we also need the user ID. So if we go to our if we go to Postman, right, you can see we also have the user ID right there, right? So we also need a user ID, which is going to be type string, right? And then the last one is favorite ID. Favorite ID, right? So now what we basically need to do here is we need to generate our model, right, using Freest, right, using the data and build runner command, if you still remember from previous episodes, right? Right, so now that we have generated our favorite model, now let's move inside our favorite repository, right, folder, and then let's start working on the repository, right? So basically we first need to create a file called favorite repository. So let's create a class called favorite repository. Alright, so now inside this favorite repository class, we'll simply, the first thing that we need is we first need to initialize the HTTP client. So now let's import the HTTP package, right? And then the next thing is we also need our local auth repository. Right, and then now we need a constructor for our favorite repository class, right? And that in this class we are now going to bind the client and then the local repository, right? And then we also need to bind the local auth repository. And then now what we're simply going to do is we are going to set our local auth repository to our local auth repository that we created, and then we also do the same thing for the client, right? All right, so now that we are done, the first method that we are going to create is the method for adding a vacancy to favorites, right? And then the second method is going to be like getting vacancies from favorites, right? And then the last one is going to be deleting a vacancy from favorites. Alright, so now let's take care of the first method, right? So the first method that we're going to do is, since we are working with API calls, we are going to use a method of type future, right? And then we are going to use ether and fp.dat for error handling, if you still remember from our previous episodes, right? And then we are just going to name the method add to favorites, right? So our method, the first thing is going to take in the vacancy ID. So to add an item to favorites, the first thing that we need is the vacancy ID. The second one is going to be the user ID. And then our function is going to be asynchronous, right? And then the first thing that we need to do is we need to create our headers, our request header. So it's going to be a type of map, type string, and then string, and then request headers. Request headers. And then on our request header, the first thing is we are going to tell our backend that our content is going to be of type application/JSON. So the content type is going to be application/JSON. And then the second thing is for our user to add items to favorites, right? They need to have like a JWT token. So if I go back to I'll just pull out our backend, right? So if we go back to our backend that we created using Express.js, if we go to our favorite route, right, you can see that for us to add an item to favorites, you can see that we first need to verify the token authorization. So we do that using JSON web tokens, right? So the type of token that we are going to be using is a bearer token. So now basically what we are going to tell our backend is we are going to pass in the authorization header. We are going to pass in the authorization header, and then this header is going to be a bearer token, and then we have a space. And then what we are simply going to do now is we are simply going to pass in our JSON web token from our local auth repository, right? So it's going to come from our local auth repository, and then we're simply going to get the user token right there, right? So if you don't have this user token, our backend will return a 401 status code that simply tells us that we are not authenticating, or we don't have the right to perform this function, right? And then now the first thing is we need to define our URL, right? So our URL is going to come from URI.http, and then our authority is going to be pass in our base URL, right? And then we are going to pass in the route, which is going to be the favorite URL right there, right? And then from there, what we need is we need a response, right? So to get a response, what we simply need to do is we need to await our client, and then we just make a post request, right, to our backend. So this post request is going to take in our URL, and then for the headers, we'll just pass in our request headers. And then for the body, right, because we need to send the body to the backend, right? And then for the body, we are simply going to pass in, we are simply going to encode the user ID and the vacancy ID, right? So we're going to use the JSON encode function, right? Then it's going to be an object where we're going to pass in the user ID. And then this user ID, we're going to get it user ID, and then we are also going to pass in the vacancy. So the vacancy is going to be vacancy ID, right, like this. And then from this, what we need now is we need to get the data, right? So to get the data, we're simply going to get the data when we decode our response from our backend. Decode the response.body, right? And then now what we can simply do is we can create a try-catch block, right? So the first thing is we are going to check if our response.status code is equal to 200, right? That means that our request is successful. Or if response.status code is equal to 201, that means that our post request is successful, right? If we get any of these scenarios, then we are simply going to return a write with our success message, right? So here we don't have the success class. So inside our, let's go back inside our utils folder. Let's go inside our utils folder, right? So what I'm simply going to do is I'm simply going to copy this app failure class, and then I'm going to create another one called success.dat, right? So we can just call it success response that. Then I'm simply going to paste it here, and then I'm simply going to change this class name to success response. We are simply going to do the same thing for our construct. Okay, so now we can go back to our favorite repository, and then we can change this to success response, right? So if we get a 200 status code or 201 status code, we are simply going to just return the success response right there. And then inside our success response, the message is going to come from, we are simply going to pass in the data and the message that we are going to get from our backend, right? And then now else, that means if we don't get a 200 or 201 status code, we are simply going to display an error message, right? So it's going to be left, and then app failure, and then data, and then we are simply going to display the message right there, right? And then after this try catch block, we're simply going to catch an error, right? We are simply going to catch an error, right? So here we are simply going to return left, and then we are simply going to pass in app failure. And then for the message, we're simply going to pass in the data and then the message. Right, so now we are done with posting our vacancy to favorites, right? So the next thing that we need to do here is we need to work on getting vacancies, right? So somehow we still have an error somewhere. So let's check where are we getting the error. Okay, it's not local auth repository, right? It's supposed to be local auth. It's supposed to be local auth repository. Okay, so it's supposed to be here. Small letter L. All right. So here we are simply going to get a list of favorite items, right? So it's going to be, our method is going to be also a future of type either. And then we are going to pass an app failure in case we have an error from our backend. And then if we have a success, we are simply going to return a list of favorite items. and then we're simply going to get favorites. And then to get those list of favorites, we'll retrieve them by the user ID, right? Since we want to get favorite items that are specific to a certain user, right? It's going to be an asynchronous function, right? And then what I'm simply going to do here, I'm simply going to go and grab everything. I'm simply going to grab our request headers, right? So I'm simply going to go and grab our request headers right there, and then need to retrieve our URL. We need to define our URL. Our URL is going to be uri.http. And then we pass in the base URL. And then we also pass in the our favorite route, right? So we're simply going to pass in our favorite route. And then to retrieve favorites by the user ID, we are simply going to also pass in the user ID, like / user ID. And then now we are simply going to get a response from our backend, right? In this case, it's going to be a GET request. So we're simply going to get using our URL. And then we also need to pass in the request headers, right? From the headers, we need to simply pass in the request headers. And then after that, we need to get the data, which we are going to just decode using JSON decode, right? And then we're simply going to pass in the response. We're going to get it from response.body. And then now we are simply going to create an empty list of type dynamic. So this list is going to just store vacancies, right? And then we are simply going to set those vacancies to the one that we are getting from response.body, right? And then now we are simply going to create a try catch block. And then we are simply, if there are any errors, we are simply going to catch those errors, right? So now what we are simply going to do here is we are simply going to check if the response dot status code is equal to 200. If the response is 200, that means we have a successful GET request. We are simply going to return, right? And then we need to return favorites from JSON. So forgot, if we go inside our favorite model here, let's go back to our vacancies. Let's go inside our vacancies model right here. So what I'm simply going to do is I'm simply going to copy this method right here, which is a list of vacancies. I'm simply going to copy it inside our favorite model, and then I'm simply going to paste it here. So I'm going to change from vacancy model to favorite model. And then I'm simply going to change this from vacancies to favorites. So what basically this method does is that since we are getting a list of vacancies, a list of favorites, right, we simply need to change them, right? We simply need to make sure that we have a method to convert that those list of vacancies, right, into a JSON object. So that's what this method does here, right? So since we are getting a list of favorites from JSON, right, and then inside that method, what we're simply going to do is simply going to pass in the vacancies right there, right? And then else, that means if we don't get a 200 status code, that means we might be getting an error. We're simply going to display that error. And then failure, and then we're simply, the message is going, okay, so it's supposed to be caps lock L, and then it's not failure, it's up failure, right? And the message is going to data and then message. If we have an error, I'm simply going to copy this, then we are simply going to return e.toString, right? All right, so now we are done with the method for getting vacancies. Now we need to deal with the method for deleting vacancies, right? For deleting vacancies, right? So what I'm simply going to do here is I'm simply going to copy this method right here, right? I'm simply going to copy it, and then I'm simply going to paste it below right there. And then we are going to change this from list to success, right? Success response, right? And then delete favorite, right? To delete the favorite icon, we need also the user ID. Everything else is correct. So instead of client.get right here, we need to change it to delete, right? So, and then what we're doing here, we're simply going to get rid of this method, and then if it's a successful success, what we're simply going to do is going to return a success response with the message, right? Then what with the message, right? So that's basically it for deleting items from our favorites, right? So now that we're done with our repository, now it's time for us to move on to our controller. Okay guys, so now that we have finished with our favorite repository, now it's time for us to move on to our favorite controller, right? So let's create a file called for favorite controller.dat. Okay, so now we need to create a class. We need to create a class called favorite controller. So this class is going to extend AsyncNotifier, right? So remember, we are using the AsyncNotifier is our state management, right? And then it's going to have it's going to be of type async value, and then the async value is going to be of type void, right? And then after this, we need to create a build function, right? So the first thing is we need to override it, right? So we need to make sure that we override the build function. So the build function is when our favorite controller is fired up, right? The first function to run is the build function, right? Just think of it as the init state, right? So basically what we are simply going to do is it's going to be of type async value, right? Normally the build function must be the same as of our type. In this case, our type is going to be async value of type void, right? So it's going to be async value void, and then build function. And then now what we are simply going to do is we are simply going to return async value, right? We are simply going to return the async value dot data, right? And then our data is going to be null, since we don't want to, at first we are not going to have any data that we want here. So now the first thing that we need to do now is we need to initialize our favorite repository, right? So let's initialize our favorite repository. And then after this, what we are simply going to do is now then set our favorite repository inside our build function, right? So what we are simply going to do is we are simply going to watch the favorite repository provider. So we forgot to do that, right? So let's go on top of our favorite repository class, and then let's create our favorite repository provider, right? And then it's going to be equal to provider, right? And then, as you know, our provider is going to check in a reference, and then we are simply going to return the favorite repository, right? We're simply going to return favorite repository. Then we are going to set our client to reference.watch, right? We are going to set our client to reference.watch. We are going to set it to HTTP provider, right? We're going to set it to HTTP provider, right? And then for our local repository, right, we are simply going to watch our local repository provider, right? Local auth repository provider, right? So now that we are done, let's go back to our favorite controller here. So what we are simply going to do here is reference.watch, and then we are simply going to watch our favorite repository provider, right? Okay, so now that we are done, now let's move inside our outside our build function, right? So the first function is going to be a future of type void, right? And then we are simply going, this function is simply going to add to favorites, right? To add item to favorites, right? And then basically what we need is we need the vacancy ID, and we also need user ID. All right, so now that we're done, it's going to be an async function, and then we are simply going to await our favorite. We are simply going to await our favorite repository, right? Dot add to favorites, right? And then, as you can see, it takes in vacancy ID and then user ID. So this should be capital letter I, right? So now that we are done, the next thing that we need to do is let's create another function, right? Which is a switch function, right? And this one switch function is going to take in res, which we have like left, which we are simply going to represent when there is an error. Right, and then if there is an error, what we are basically going to do is we are simply going to show a snack bar, right? We are basically going to display a snack bar, and then what we simply need to do here is we need to also create a build context, right? So we need to create a build context, and then context, right? So what we are simply going to do here is we're simply going to show passing the context, and then we are simply going to display the error if there is an error, right? And then the next thing also is we also, if there is, and then if it's successful also, so it's going to be L dot so let's import fp.dat, right? So let's just make sure that we import fp.dat here, there. All right, l.message, right? And then let's do the same thing for, we're simply going to rename this to right, and then error. And then if there is a message, we are simply going to display that message if it's successful. So it's going to be error.toString, right? So now that we are done with adding items to favorites, so now what I'm basically going to do is I'm going to copy this function, and then I'm simply going to paste it below here. So now here, since here we are going to retrieve a list of favorites, right? So it's going to be a favorite model. And then basically what I'm simply going to do is I'm going to rename this to get favorites, right? Get favorites. And then do we need any parameter? Yes, we need a parameter. So the parameter is going to be an user ID, and then we simply get rid of this right here, and then we rename it to get favorites, and then we pass in the user ID, right? And then basically what we need to do is so it's saying we're returning a return type of now. Okay, so what we need to do here is we just need to return a switch, right? We're simply going to return a switch statement, but I'm getting an error. So let me see what's going on here. So here, if we have an error, we're simply going to throw that error right there. And then I'm struggling. What's going? Say void can't. But this is not a void function, right? Right, so let's just get rid of this, and then let's just try to return a switch statement, right? Switch response, right? Then what we're simply going to do is going to return left value, and then final L, and then if there's an error, we're simply going to call that error, right? Then value, final R. Then what we're simply going to do is we are simply going to return that R. Okay, now that we are done, now let's just copy this function again. Let's copy it. I'll simply paste it below. So now let's rename it to delete favorite, and then to delete what we do, we need a favorite ID. So let's get rid of this, and then let's just rename this to favorite ID. Right, so now that we are done, let's rename our function here. It's to delete favorites, right? And then it's simply going to take in a favorite ID. All right. Okay, so now that we are done with our favorite controller, right? So basically what we simply need to do now is we need to create our favorite controller provider, right? Our favorite controller provider, which is going to be an AsyncNotifier. And then it takes in our class, which is our favorite controller, and then an async value of type void, right? And then it takes in AsyncNotifier. It's supposed to be AsyncNotifier provider, right? Right, and then what we're simply going to do here is simply going to return our favorite controller.new. Right, so we are done. So now we need to create another provider for getting our favorites, and then also for deleting items, right? So basically what we are doing here, what I'll do here is I'll create one by now, get favorites provider. So this one is going to be it's going to be a future provider. And then we used family property because now we want to pass in an argument, because we want to pass in the user ID, right? So we want to pass in the user ID right there. And then what we'll simply do is we'll create a variable for our favorites, which is equal to reference.watch. And then it's going to be favorite controller.notifier. And then basically what we need to do here is we'll simply return our favorites, right? We'll simply return our favorites, right? So, okay, so now that we are done with our favorite controller, now it's time for us to move on to our favorite screen, right? So if we can just pull off, let's just see if we can just pull off. You can see we have the favorite item here with the vacancy. We have the vacancy here, and then we have the delete icon, we have the salary, and then we have the tags, right? So this is the vacancy, the favorite item widget, right? And then so let's go inside our favorite folder, right? And then under favorites, let's create a subfolder called widgets, right? And then let's create another called favorite item widget.dat, right? So it's going to be a stateless widget, right? Item widget, right? So basically what this widget would check in, it would check in the vacancy model, right? So to check in the vacancy model, then let's just name it vacancy model, right? And then let's get rid of this constant property, because now we have a dynamic required this vacancy model, right? So we have now passed the vacancy model right there. And then the next thing that we just need to do is we need to return a card widget, right? So we need to return a card widget, and then inside this card widget would then pass in the color. So the color is going to be white, right? So then pass in a white color right there, and then we'll also give it an elevation of 5, right? So let's give it an elevation of 5, and then the child is going to be a size box, right? So let's give it a size box, and then what we're simply going to do is we're simply the child is going to be a stack, right? Because we want to stack widgets, right? So now we have children right there, right? And then we also have a column widget, right? We have a column widget, then children. So under this stack widget, after this column widget, the top of this column widget, what we'll do is we'll place a position widget, right? A position widget, and then we want it from the top, we want it to be 10 pixels from the top, and then we want it to be 10 pixels up from the right? And then the children for this one is going to be an icon, right? So let's pass in the icon right there. And then the icon is going to be icons.delete, right? All right, like that. Okay, so now if we refresh our mobile application, so let's see iPhone 16 Plus. So if I can stop this, and then if we run it, let's run it on our emulator, right? Let's run it on our emulator, and then we want to see how it appears, right? So okay, it's not appearing yet, but you should see it should appear next to this item, right? Because this icon is going to be 10 pixels away from the top right there, right? So that's how we use like the stacked widget right there, right? So now what we can do is, or what I can do is, if we go inside our favorite screen, right? Let's go inside our favorite screen. So what we're simply going to do, we're going to return a scaffold widget, and then let's say the body, let's say it's going to be a favorite item widget like this, right? But we need to pass in the vacancy module. Okay, so let's just get rid of this, and then let's continue with our video, our application, right? So the first thing that we need to do here is we need to display a text widget. And so we need to display a text, right? So as you can see, the text is going to be vacancy module dot title, and then dot toString, right? And then what we are simply going to do here is we are going to style the text, right? Text style, and then the font size is going to be 20. And then what we are simply going to do is the color is going to be black. The color is going to be black, and then we will give it a font weight, and we'll give it a font weight of font weight .w700, right? Like this, okay. And then after that, we need a spacing, okay? So we'll give it a spacing size box, and then the spacing, we'll give it a height of 10, right? Simply give it a height of 10. And then after this, what we simply need to do now is we need to display the salary, right? So now the thing is, we don't want this text to be close to our screen, right, edges. So we'll just give it a padding right there, right? And then let's copy this text also with the padding widget, and then let's just paste it below, and then we'll change the font size to 15, and then the font weight, we just change it to W600, right? And then as you can see, also we also need a spacing, so we just copy the spacing here right there, and then I'll just paste it below, right? And then after this, what else do we need? We need a vacancy tags list widget, right? And then we pass in the vacancy module right there, right? And then I'll make sure also we apply padding, right? So let's also apply padding to this, right? All right, so to our delete icon right there, right here, what we'll simply do is we'll simply wrap it with the gesture detector, right? Because we want to handle how the user will simply wrap it with the gesture detector, right? And then also need an on-tap function right there, right? So need an on-tap function. So what we simply going to do here is we need to change our widget from stateless widget to consumer widget. If you still remember, for us to be able to access providers inside a widget, we need consumer widget, and then we need to pass in the widget reference as a parameter to our build context, right? And then this reference function will just allow us to access our providers, right? So basically now what we do is reference dot read, right? So inside buttons or gestures, right, we use reference.get and to read function, right? Favorite controller provider dot notifier, and then what we simply need dot delete favorites, right? So to delete a favorite, what we need is a favorite ID, right? So favorite ID, right? So to remove it, we are simply going to pass in the vacancy ID, right? Dot vacancy ID, and then dot toString, right? So that's the vacancy that we want to get rid of right there, right? And then now that we are done, Now that we are done, now let's move on to the favorite list icon, right? So as you can see from our favorites, it's going to be a list of favorites, right? But we have only created this widget for one item. So I want to create a list, right? So basically now that's basically what we are going to do. So let's create a favorite list widget, widget.dat, right? Like this, right? So let's go inside our favorite list widget. Then it's going to be a stateless widget, and then let's rename it to favorite list widget, right? Favorite list widget. It's going to be a consumer widget, right? It's going to be a consumer widget, and then we need to pass in the widget reference, and then let's just import Flutter Riverpod right there, right? And then what we need, we also need the user ID. So let's get the user ID. So to get the user ID, we are going to get it from reference.watch, right? They're going to watch our local auth repository provider, and then we are going to simply get our user ID, right? So we are simply going to get our user ID right there. And then we also need our favorites, right? We need to get our favorites. So it's going to be the reference. We want to watch our get favorites provider, and then what we simply need to do here is we simply need to pass in the user ID to string, right? That's what we are going to do here. And then what we are simply going to do is we are going to simply return our favorites dot when, and then here what we're simply going to do is data, and then what we're simply going to, this parameter is going to take in an error and then a stack trace. And then what we are simply going to do is we're simply going to return an error widget, right? Okay, it's not error widget, error text, right? And then make sure that it's error.toString, right? And then if we're still loading our data from our backend, what we simply have to do is we simply have to return a loader function right there. Okay, so now that we are done, what we are simply going to do now is we are simply going to check if our data is if data dot so what's going on here, reference.watch. Okay, so first thing is let's try to return a list builder, right? List builder, right? And then the item count is going to be data.length, right? So I think there must be an error somewhere. So let's go to our favorites controller, right? Get favorites provider, friends.watch. Okay, then get favorites. Yeah, that's why we're kind of getting an error right there. And it also takes in a build context, right? So let's get rid of the build context because we are not displaying any errors there. So let's just get rid of the build context right there. Then let's go back to get favorites, and then let's just get rid of the context, right? Okay, now that All right, so now we can basically we can check if the data dot is empty, right? If we don't have, if from our backend we don't have any favorites item, what we're simply going to do is we're simply going to return a text, right? Center child text, and then the text is going to just say vacancies added here. All right, so now, and then here we'll simply it's data dot length, right? And then we item build, I will make sure that it takes in a context and an index. Context and then an index, right? And then we'll need to make sure that shrimp rep is equal to true, right? Shrimp rep is equal to true, right? And then what we are simply going to do is also we need a physics, right? We also need physics. So physics is never scroll physics, right? Let's just make sure I give it a constant, right? So after this, what we're simply going to do is we'll simply return a gesture detector. We will simply return a gesture detector and then pass the on-tap function, right? Pass the on-tap function, right? So what this will do is, and then the child is simply going to be for the gesture detector, right? So the child is simply going to be favorite item widget, right? Favorite item widget, and then we'll simply pass in our data and then index and then dot vacancy, right? Like this, right? And then just put semicolon and then semicolon, and then here what we simply do is want to navigate to, so we use navigator class dot push named, right? And then we'll pass in the route name. The route name is going to be routes dot, so let's just import the routes class right there, right? It's going to be routes dot vacancy detail screen, right? Vacancy detail screen right there, right? So now that we are done, let's move on to our favorite screen, right? So let's move on to our favorite screen. So this is our screen widget, favorite screen, and then what we simply need to do here is we'll also change this to consumer widget. Consumer widget. Now we simply have to pass in widget reference, right? Reference, and then our body will simply wrap our body with the safe area widget, right? So safe area widget, and then the child is going to be a single child score view, right? Single child score view. Then child is going to be a column widget, children. Then we are going to have a text, and then we are simply saying favorites, and then we'll simply style it, right? Simply style it, and then font weight, it's going to be font weight dot bold. Font weight dot bold, right? And then font size is going to be 15, right? So now that we are done, Okay, so let's make sure that we just center this text widget. So let's center the text widget. And then after this, what we are simply going to do is we are simply going to display the favorite list widget, right there. Okay, so display the favorite list widget. And then what we need to do also is we also need to get the user ID. So it's going to be reference.watch. So we are simply going to watch the local auth repository, right? And then we are simply going to get our user ID right there, right? Get user ID. And then the next thing is favorites. So the favorites, we are simply going to watch our provider, right? The get favorites provider, right? So we simply have to watch our provider, right? And then we have to pass in a user ID to string, right? All right. So the next thing that we need to do is we need to wrap our single child score view with a refresh indicator, right? So it's going to be a refresh indicator right there. And then what we simply have to do is the background color for a refresh indicator is going to be colors.black. Okay, and then the next thing is on refresh, right? We want to handle when the user refreshes, when he pulls our screen to refresh, right? So what you simply have to do is, the nice thing about Riverpod is allows us to use the refresh function, right? So, and then this refresh function will just allow us to just watch the get favorites provider, and then we'll just pass on the user ID right there, right? So it's supposed to be user ID.toString, right? So somehow we're getting an error, so let's see what's going on. Okay, so we need to use the future function, right, to allow us to refresh, right? Okay, so now that we are done, let's refresh our application, and then let's see if we are getting items from our favorites, right? Yeah, you can see now we have this one item from our favorites right there, and then you can see it has been deleted, so we can also pull to refresh, right? So now the only thing is, like, we need to add an icon to add items to favorites right here, right? So that's what we are going to do. Okay, so now let's go inside our vacancy item widget, right? So screen widgets, under vacancies, we can go to our vacancy item widget, right? So basically what we are simply going to do is so we have this vacancy item, right? So I'm simply going to wrap this column widget with a stack widget, right? So let's wrap it with the okay, so what we basically do is, let me undo this, right? So first thing is we'll wrap it with a column widget, and then we'll then change this column widget to a stack, right? Stack widget, right? So let's now go here, right? And then we'll create a position widget, right? So this is going to be a position widget, and then the child is going to be image.asset, right? Image.asset. And then from our, let's check inside our assets folder, right? So it's going to come from our assets /images, and then /favorite.png, right? So now what we simply have to do here is we'll give it a height of 20 and then a width of 20. Let's give it a height of 20 and also give it a width of 20, right? Give it a width of 20 right there, right? And then what we simply have to do is we'll wrap it with a gesture detector widget. gesture detector widget, and then on check. Once we check on that function, what we want to simply do here is we have to simply reference.read, right? Reference.read. So we are going to read the favorite controller provider .notifier, and then dot add to favorites, right? And then what we are going to do here is we're simply going to pass in the vacancy model dot vacancy ID, right? Vacancy ID dot toString, right? And then the next thing is we also need our user ID. So basically what we're going to do is final, let's get our user ID, which we are going to get from reference.watch. We're simply going to watch the local auth repository, right? So local auth repository, and then .get user ID, right? Okay. And then let's simply pass in the user ID here. And then we just convert it to string, right? To a string, right? Then now we are done with this. So basically now what you can simply do is let's run our emulator, right? And then let's see. So now when we pull our emulator, and then let's see if our application is working, right? So it's supposed to be top right position widget. So I forgot from the top, we want it to be top 10 from the top, and then from the right also want it to be 10, right? So I'll just watch reload our application, and then you can see now it is moved, right? And you can see now added to favorites. And then if we try to edit again, you can see that the backend will tell us like favorite already exists, right? So, and then also we can also add this one. Then we can also add this one right there. And then let's go again inside our vacancy details. We want to do it also inside our vacancy details page. So let's just go inside our vacancy details page, right? Screen, vacancy details screen right there. So I think we have this custom circle. We'll wrap it with a gesture detector. Gesture detector, and then on tab, right? And then what we simply do here is the reference.read. So let's change this from consumer widget, from stateless widget to consumer widget, right? And then let's import Flutter Riverpod. Let's pass in widget reference to our build function, right? Reference, right? Okay, so now what we simply do is we need to get our user ID. So user ID is equal to reference.watch, right? Local auth. So what we're simply going to do is we're going to watch our local auth repository, and then get our user ID right there. Get user ID right there, right? And then what we simply need to do here is we need to import our favorite controller, and then add to vacancy. So what's the name here? Vacancy. So let's just remove it to vacancy, and then what we simply do is let's refresh our application and let's check. So if we go inside our vacancy details page, you can see now it's telling us vacancy already exists, right? Because we've already added that vacancy to favorites. Here we can add this vacancy to favorites. You can see now if I go to our, we can see now we now have a list of vacancies right there. Right, so it's a vacancy model in the type cast, right? So it's because it's being given as nullable. Okay, So now we are simply going to fix that in the next video, right? Simply going to fix that in the next video. But as you can see, okay, you can see that this item is in the middle. So let's go inside our favorite item widget, right? We need to fix that. So let's go inside our favorite item widget right there. And then main axis alignment. We need to change our main axis alignment to main axis alignment start, and then also our cos axis alignment. We also need to change to cos axis alignment dot start, right? All right, so now that we are done with this, let's now refresh and then let's see. Yeah, now we can see now it's coming out nice, right? So in the next video, we're just going to fix this our error we're getting when you get to favorite to our vacancy details page, right?